Hello, everyone. Welcome back to You Thought You Knew, the podcast where we talk about Survivor players that may be underrated, underappreciated, or just misunderstood. Each episode, we'll try to answer a question that's designed to make us challenge our preconceived notions about a famous Survivor contestant. Of course, there are no right answers, it's just an excuse to talk about our favorite show. As always, I'm Nigel Bocanegra and am joined by my partner in crime, Kevin McLain.
Yes, excited to be here, and we have a fun episode and a fun guest, so it's going to be a great time.
Yes, and we are joined by the Mary Kwiatkowski. Mary, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. Although I will disagree with you. I think there is a right answer, and it's whatever I come up with.
Love that. That's like my perspective on all things politics too.
So, Kevin, who we're going to be talking about today?
We're going to talk about JT Thomas, and I can get started with this dramatic introduction. After he won Survivor Tocantins, JT became the first person to play a perfect game. With no votes cast against him and winning unanimously against a worthy Stephen Fishback, it was no surprise that he would be invited to play again just 2 seasons later. However, in Heroes vs. Villains, his move to give Russell Hantz an idol would go down in dumb move infamy. At that point, several fans questioned whether JT was ever that good at the game to begin with. And after another subpar showing in Survivor Game Changers, JT's legacy felt like a far cry from his dominant Tocantins win. But should later appearances discredit an original performance, people were literally throwing their games away for JT's aw shucks attitude. You thought you knew JT Thomas? Well, we think we do. And on this episode of You Thought You Knew, we'll be answering the question, is JT Thomas overrated?
So, to start to unpack this a little bit, Mary, what do you think makes someone an overrated Survivor contestant? What kind of comes to your mind?
It's really interesting because without giving away too many spoilers, I'll say that one of the other options that you gave me to talk about was a person who I do find to be very overrated, and so I didn't want to talk about them because I felt like I was just going to be negative. I think when it comes to someone being overrated, what it really is a misunderstanding of at least what I think is important to the game. So if you were saying that someone is a really great, the best survivor fisherman ever, but then you framed it as, oh, they're one of the best players ever, I would say, well, they're overrated as a player. You remember them because they were a good fisher person or whatever. But I think when it comes to being overrated in the grand scheme, it's a misunderstanding of who someone is, what's important toward the grading criteria, and also, like, do you actually remember things about them? Are you just rating them a certain way based off of like a one-time viewing from a long time ago? It's like how you remember a dream or something that happened to you when you were a kid. Like, are you really giving it the credit it deserves when looking at it here and now?
Yeah, no, I love that as a perspective here, because my biggest thing is if you meet someone who's a Survivor fan, and I feel bad for all the ones that have to meet us because it's 2 of us at the same time and we're going to ask you a lot of questions and get very excited. And if you name someone that you love and you can't really discuss why they're great, I always find that very suspicious. It's like, well, like what about it? Like, what are the things? And then they can't usually capture the moments because most people aren't going to think that deeply about any Survivor contestant to begin with. So I have a lot of strong opinions when, and I think I take it personally when I find someone overrated because I love so many of the underrated people in general. You know?
And I think that's also something that, like, the word overrated implies that they would be rated high by certain people. And so I think there's nothing wrong with liking with overrating people based on your own fondness for them, right? Like you said that you like so many of the underrated people, meaning to you they're rated high based on your appreciation of them. And I feel that way a lot of times about movies, and I'll see a movie and I'll love it. Like I famously watched like Bullet Train like 4 times in theaters. That's not the best movie in the world, and I feel like there were people who heard my talk of how much I loved it and thinking, oh my gosh, well, it must be this really great thing, and then they saw it and they're like, Mary, it's way overrated. And I'm like, no, It's not. It's not that it's overrated. It's properly rated for me. I just love that thing. It's fine to love something that's like not the best or to like something based on your own criteria. But like if you're saying we're rating this, it has to be like the whole Survivor fan community are rating these people. Where do they stack up? Right.
And I think it's a really interesting way to kind of frame whether or not someone is overrated because we're talking about JT today, who has been on 3 separate seasons of Survivor. Heroes versus Villains was one of the first 3 seasons I think I ever saw. I jumped ahead a little too aggressively, I think, in going to a returnee season so early on. But Heroes versus Villains is a season I've seen several times. Game Changers, JT's third outing, I've only ever seen live. So as we prepared for today's podcast, we did go back and watch some episodes. But it's also kind of interesting to reflect on some of those JT moments that maybe I would not rate super highly because I've only seen them one time and I don't really remember them nearly as well as some of the Tocantins Heroes versus Villains episodes. Do you, Pearson?
Yeah. It's very interesting to think about, like, who's overrated, and I think it could be like a compliment to be overrated because you have to be. It means that you're well liked. It's a kind of like punching up to complain about it, though I'm sure it's not easy to take that type of criticism. It's like the only people that can be overrated are people who are very successful. Like, is Beyonce overrated? I mean, probably just because we think of her as a goddess, and she's technically not one, but like she's still better than, like, even if you think someone's overrated, you can still think they're great. Maybe they're just not the same level that your personal taste is.
And it probably changes over time, right? Because when Beyonce first comes on the scene and everyone's like, oh my gosh, their expectations were lower and therefore they rated higher. But when you come into Beyonce and say Beyonce is the best, if there's anything Beyonce puts out music that you don't like, you're like, well, okay, overrated, right? And so I think that that's a really big factor when it comes to JT. You've got 3 showings, 3 very different showings, and over the years, his rating is going to change. So you're going to have, when he first comes out, you're not going to think necessarily that much of him. And then he does so well. So you say, boom, rated super high. Any future thing, he's based off of that first initial rating. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
So Mary, the question, do you think JT is overrated?
I think JT is not overrated. I think that he deserves his rating.
Ah, okay.
And Kevin?
I think actually, I'm just like waiting for everyone to be so mad at my answer. Because Mary, you may not know this, but one of our first appearances on RHAP was on the dynamic duos.
Oh, I remember. Remember. Yeah,
So
I was. I'm just gonna tell you guys, I was yelling at my podcast for that one.
So, like, and just like many people, I will say I have never got JT, I feel like, in the way that he resonates with so many people. But it's kind of like Taylor Swift, who's also never done it for me. But like, undeniably, if you're that big of a superstar, maybe I'm the problem. So I have to like kind of be unbiased and take a step back. And I would say that I don't think JT is overrated because I think there's been such a swift backlash against him that makes him properly rated. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's a pretty good way to describe it. I think if you were only looking at JT in Tocantins, looking at the perfect game he has, I think it'd be very easy to think of him as overrated. But when you add in Heroes versus Villains and Game Changers, I think it gives him some additional depth. I've watched the show for a longer and longer period of time. I seem to care less and less about actual gameplay, and I'm more interested in the characters themselves. And I think that I appreciated that the more seasons that JT was on, I think you're getting more and more character from him. But when he's in Tocantins, how do you not focus on the success that he has in the game? So I'm saying I don't think JT is overrated.
And it's interesting because I kind of agree with what Kevin was saying, which is part of the reason I don't think he's overrated is because it is so popular now to say that he is overrated. And so it's like we've kind of swung back, right? There was a time when everyone loved him. And then especially after Heroes versus Villains, it was like, wow, why did we think he was so good? You hear constantly the JT's nothing without Steven. Like clearly the win had all to do with that, which I don't think is true. We'll get into when we talk about Tocantins. But I think a lot of JT's future gameplay, like Nigel was saying, brought out more of the the reality that it is difficult to play the game the same way multiple times. You have to change it up. And sometimes those things work and sometimes those things don't. And I don't think that that discredits anything that he did the first time around. And I also don't think it discredits anything he did in subsequent seasons necessarily. They just didn't work, but he was trying. And there are so many other players who had one really good showing and then other poor showings that I feel like they just either their heart wasn't in it or they didn't try or there were other circumstances that, made them fall from grace even more than JT did.
Yeah, I think JT is fun as a returnee because he says, I am going to deliver. You're bringing me back, and I'm going to go all out and make sure that I have earned this return.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like if someone ever asked me, do I like JT? I think I would like hesitate for a moment because I don't love him in the way that so many other people love him. So to me, it's like I've always had, I think, a bit of a discrepancy with that. Well, I will always say that I like him enough. I appreciate him. I think he brings a lot to the show. I think he probably is a snubbed pick for Winners at War. Like he's such a big character that crosses so many different eras. Like I think he's so much to the show. And I just want to make it clear that I do not hate JT. Unlike what some of the YouTube comments suggested on the Dynamic Duos podcast, I don't hate JT. I just have never, I've just never found his edit to be as complex and as resonating with me as it is for so many other people. And it's about my preferences. So I'm really excited to kind of get into JT and kind of like how we all see him.
Yeah. So
just to say one last thing is, while we talk about this, I want you to think about in the back of your head someone who I think has in some ways a similar story arc. Think about Colby Donaldson and a similar very high initial rating, even though he didn't win, and then a similar sort of fall from grace. But that's like a person that I would say is much more overrated, right, than JT is, because I think that we'll find here that JT did a lot more himself to in a similar archetype to prove that he has a little bit more skill in the game going on. And I know that JT and Colby are different, but that was like the first person when I was thinking about comparing storylines over multiple seasons.
And I will just say, I think it's a great comparison to make, right? Because even though they are different people, like, I mean, they both were on top of the world at their height. And, but I would also say that even though maybe their gameplay has been critiqued more since them, or like maybe a lot of the casual fans have gone down on them, I kind of find that their own failures make them more dimensional and more interesting. So I like higher on them because of those things, because generally, I find likability to be a con in my Survivor contestants. I like them to be terrible people generally, or chaotic or confrontational or bad at the game, because I want something to kind of like chew on. And we just did a podcast on Xian Wang. It was one of my favorites as a kid. And it's like, she's the last thing you would probably describe her is likable and affable based on how her fellow tribe mates have ever felt about her. But like, she resonates with me because I really identify with kind of the plucky underdog. And JT, while he has some of those moments, that's not his like the way he's being perceived by most fans. So
you're what you're saying is that you love Survivor Worlds Apart.
I
famously absolutely love Worlds Apart.
Yeah, maybe if Worlds Apart was as in like a Gabon context, maybe if there were like different people, like it feels like it's like a worst case nightmare without any of the fun upside.
It doesn't have a lot of the joy that I think you can get at.
Yeah.
In some of the other messy seasons as well. So Kev, for those who maybe have not seen some of JT's seasons recently, would you like to go through some of the quick hits about his journey?
Sure. So JT wins Tocantins, this 18th season of the show. He comes on as a 24-year-old cattle rancher from Alabama.
24. Oh my gosh.
He's so young
now. Right? I had no idea he was that young.
And
I was going to guess like 28. Oh my gosh.
I know. He's so young. And I think that's even more credit to him. As I get older, I'm like, wow, that's really impressive that he was able to like. No.
It was actually kind of brutal going back to watch Game Changers and seeing like, how old was JT in Game Changers? Because I remember him coming back and thinking like, oh yeah, he does seem a lot older. This is like a different JT. And I looked it up and I'm almost like the exact same age now as he was when he filmed Game Changers. And it's like, oh no, I'm becoming the old one.
JT probably has the same like cultural references as us. He like watched the same TV shows. Like he's like this. Like we could have gone to the same high school.
Gosh.
We're
Okay,
like so close
sorry.
in age.
I won't interrupt again. That just really hit me hard.
Yeah, 24 years old. And he does play the first perfect game because there was no throwaway votes against him, no negative votes at all. And he wins unanimously, getting all the jury votes. And he's notable for having a very strong social game and his partnership with Steven. In Heroes versus Villains, the 20th season, he returns on the Heroes tribe, where he's notable for being the hero who's changing his game and becoming more of a villain. And he's the central power player in the Heroes tribe. And his game kind of comes undone because he gives the idol that he had to Russell, which then gets to Parvati, which she plays, and one of the most fascinating tribal councils of all time. And he becomes a juror there, 10th place. And then in Game Changers, he comes back, but he only places 16th because he's swapped into a minority and is blindsided with an idol in his pocket. So, JT has really run the gambit. He's been a winner, a juror, a pre-juror. I can't imagine what placement he could get next if he was ever to play again.
Medevac, right? Just something that has not
appeared
yet. Mary, what do you think some of your top JT moments are?
So I think it's interesting because the main angle I have on JT through all this is he came out as such a maybe not for Kevin, but I think for a lot of the world, a lot of the casual fans especially, like such an endearing, rootable figure in his first season. I think a lot of people liked his partnership with Steven, and I think that there were plenty of people who were rooting for Steven to win or would have been perfectly happy with a Steven win, myself among them. But for me, it was like as a kid, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I guess I was a kid in 2009. It's the moment when he's like playing the challenge and gets his tooth knocked out. That's like the first thing I remember thinking, oh, wow, well, you got to let this guy win, right? Like, look how he's putting his heart out there. He's trying so hard. And I'll fully admit at the time, like I didn't know about Survivor Sucks or deep dives on Reddit or anything. So I'm watching it with the mindset of like, yeah, I want someone who's strategic, but I also want someone who's going to really try at the challenges, right? And so that's like the first thing I thought of when it came to JT. And then I think in subsequent seasons, JT did what a lot of the other successful players have done, which is here's the perception everyone has about me. I'm going to try to do something different. Everyone thinks I'm a hero. Because I don't have the Steven to work with, I can't play that same game again. I have to do something different. Otherwise, I'm going to be targeted or voted out or whatever. So I need to change it up. Everybody knows about the failed idea with the Russell letter, but I think to his credit, you could imagine Boston Rob doing a similar thing. You could imagine, players who have also tried to make, you could imagine like Sarah Lucina doing a similar thing, saying, I'm the cop and now I'm going to play like the criminal. Like that kind of idea, I think, is what he was doing. And then my other favorite moment is one from each season, Game Changers. The moment where he takes his tribe fishing and then jumps off the boat and ditches them and goes back to look for an idol. It doesn't work, but it is so close to being the same thing that Boston Rob does in Redemption Island, where he tries to have his tribe go do something and then, go find the idol. But it fails partially because it's very obvious what he's doing. He has no finesse. And then partially because he doesn't find an idol in that moment. So I think with JT, it comes from like his mind being in the right place of the kind of things he needs to do. It would have been really interesting to try and watch him in either Heroes versus Villains or Game Changers try to play the same game he did the first time. Would that have worked better? My hunch is I don't know if it would have worked worse, but it probably still would not have gotten him the win. Like I can see that. And, for like myself, I've played online Survivor games, and when you do well, one of your biggest fears coming back to play again is how am I going to live up to that? I need to change things up. I can't play that same game. I'm going to have a target, et cetera, et cetera. And I can just imagine that it must be 10 times harder when you're actually playing Survivor and there are people on your tribe that you overhear talking about winners and stuff. And especially in returning player seasons, targeting the winners has been a thing. So I think he had a right to be nervous and at least tried to zag on him.
And I think it's actually very impressive to return and try to play a genuinely different game. We hear so much about contestants that go out there and they want to play a specific style of game, only to realize, well, when you're starving, when you're being betrayed, when people are lying to you, it's not as easy to play the exact way you'd maybe planned ahead of time. So to be able to come back and actually switch things up and take a different approach, I do think is really impressive.
And I will say I also I appreciate a good rebrand, if you will. And I feel like that's what kind of JT does. He's like, it's like a new Madonna album is out. Like he's totally willing to embrace and change it up, which I think is really cool. I love it when also someone has like a makeover. They gave a different haircut, different tribe colors. I love seeing like a slightly different. So like I'm very appreciative of JT for a lot of those
JT's
things.
Eras tour. If you
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and what's interesting when you talk about like, people having a makeover or whatever, there are players that you can think of. Ozzy is a good example, who more or less try a lot of the same types of things over and over. Maybe a different attitude, maybe a different outlook, but try similar, a similar approach each time. And it doesn't work. Same with Russell Hantz, right? Russell Hantz tries the same approach multiple times. It doesn't work. So seeing JT at least try something different, I applaud that. You also hear Rob talk a lot about like people trying to play like the winners of their season, but JT won his season and he won in a very, vocal way. Like he was the first perfect, game player or whatever. The bar was too high for him. He wasn't going to be able to recreate the same thing probably. So he needed to change it up. And I don't know. You think about like, did he try to play like Steven or like anyone else from his season? Or was he just, trying to completely mix it up and do something different? What is the real JT? And like you just said, JT at 24 is probably very different than JT at 32. Imagine how your own life has shaped the difference in how you're going to have that like outlook, of what you're playing. And also playing on a returning season is so different from playing on a new player season, because you can't hide behind the mask of your first game, especially when it's like, oh, perfect JT with the perfect score, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate his commitment in Heroes versus Villains to not play a perfect game because I think it makes it a better season because he's willing to kind of like just shoot for the fences,
mix things up. Yeah, I also really love the moment in Game Changers when he leaves Nuko in the ocean. I think it's great. But I think another top JT moment for me is actually the Tocantins final tribal. I think that you really do get a lot of his, maybe not combativeness with Steven, but really like being able to like push back on Steven. And Steven seems like he was like really flustered and didn't exactly, I don't think that Steven was as prepared for that final tribal as JT was. And I thought it was like really fun getting to go back and kind of relive the final tribal and seeing how dominant JT actually was in it.
Yeah. I think my favorite, both y'all took mine. And I have like the least JT moments to pull from, I think. So because I've always felt that I always got that JT was likable and we're supposed to root for him. And I rooted for the Jolly when I watched Tocantins. But in general, I feel like JT's always primed against the people I want to root for, which are quite often just outspoken women, right? Because it's like, it's like Aaron, he'd rather work with like Coach, it really kind of gun to his head. That's like, those are the people he's more drawn to. And then in Heroes versus Villains, I really did like Candace, Cody, and I liked a lot of the villain people. Like he's like targeting Parvati and Sandra. And then in Game Changers, he's against like Sandra and Michaela. It's like, I just can't catch a break with this guy. And he's so charming, at the end of the day. And I think the only time I've ever truly rooted for him was in that challenge where he broke the tooth, because I think that's like one of the most badass moments that's ever happened. Because I'd immediately be like, someone call my insurance. Like, let me get all of this
crying.
Stuff. This would be a serious thing.
I think I would say, I think I should go home. I think you should medevac me.
Yeah. It's like, actually, I would like you get a dentist on site right now. Give me some fillers because I don't want any of my smile to be broken up like in any of these like interviews. No way. And then the second one was the final tribal, because I thought I think my concern with JT was that maybe he was a little one-dimensional in my view, that he's just this likable kind of like good old boy. And I kind of was very much rooting for Steven at the time, who identified far more and was like kind of ready for Steven to slit JT's throat as the game progressed. And JT kept winning immunity and never gave him the chance. So it's kind of fun at the final tribal council to see JT, I think metaphorically, spank Steven essentially. I mean, he really nails him to the point where I was really won over that moment. I go, JT totally deserves to win. Like, just look at how commanding that performance is, he won me over in that moment. And I will say, even with his like subpar, returns and performances that people will say, I've always thought he totally deserved to win Tocantins. And I don't think you can retroactively take a win away from someone. So,
well, and what's so interesting about Tocantins in that win is that I think it's really easy to watch most of that season and think, okay, JT is just sort of being himself and riding off of his charm and letting Steven do a lot of the work. I think once you see that final tribal and you hear him say, "Oh, Steven, I would never have said anything bad about you," or whatever it was, I think what you're seeing is, no, JT knew the perception that people would have of him. He knew that he was endearing. And so he played that card, and he played that card all season. And then at the end, you kind of, as the audience, you see, oh, this is a thing he's playing up. It probably truly is a lot of who his personality was at 24. But I think that's exactly the same as, Parvati playing the flirt game. I think it's the same as a lot of these other big characters realizing I've got, charisma. Oh my gosh, I almost said Riz, and I'm so glad I didn't. But like I've got the charisma, I've got the ability to win people over, and I don't need to do a lot more than that. But if the time came where I needed to, I'm going to. I mean, you see that when he refuses to vote coach out, right? He's playing a game in that moment. He's got some game savvy. It's not just all, oh shucks, I'm so nice. Because I think if he truly was like just 100%, the good guy that a lot of people thought he was, I think that note voting for coach would have come across very differently. I think he would have probably instead approached coach before the tribal and said, I've got to vote for you because I want to be honest or whatever. Or it would have just come across very different. But instead it came across like, oh no, this is a strategic plan and he's doing it.
Yeah, great points. Nigel, did you have any other JT moments you wanted to highlight?
I mean, I think it's hard to not just go back to the letter again. We have mentioned it, but it is such a good moment that we still talk about as one of the really big moments of what is considered by many people to be the best or one of the best seasons of all time. I think we also, because it is so unsuccessful, we kind of think of it as JT going like way too hard, playing too fast, too loose. I actually don't think it's crazy for them to look over and believe that there is a women's alliance running things on the villains tribe. I would have maybe tried to do a little more verification before giving away some idol advantage, right? But I don't think it's crazy for him to have a theory that that's where things are headed. And, maybe in a different universe, if done a little differently, it could have been more successful.
Yeah, I mean, and I've always heard this, and it's like as a television viewer, I appreciate the swinging for the fences and like, but I always hear people say like, had he been right? And it's like, well, had he been right about a bunch of stuff, everyone's a genius. Like it doesn't change that like he was wrong. He was so wrong. And Mary, we actually recorded our Eric Reichenbach episode with Rob that I think hasn't aired exactly yet. And on it, we talk about, is Eric the dumbest driver of all time? Because his giving up the immunity is quite often referred to that. But I think talking to Rob, we kind of like came down that I think the JT move is dumber. And I recognize that it's a more complex long-term thing, but Eric got tricked by 4 very strong Survivor players, and JT tricked himself. And I think that's like the byline. Because I remember thinking when he won the dumbest move award, Heroes versus Villains, I thought, oh, that's just recency bias. But now that his time is gone, I'm like, I think it is like it's like, again, like how if you're so smart, you like galaxy brain your way into the dumbest decision possible. Like I feel like I've done that all the time, or maybe like lacking common sense at a certain level. But I think JT letter is really exciting, and I will also say I think he has a very underrated penmanship skills. I feel like the right, like the letter's well written. No,
I was just gonna go ahead and say that my hat into the ring of the worst moves is, I actually think, different move from heroes versus villains. I think the Tyson voting himself out is actually the worst, because that's a scenario of you you know if you trust your allies who've all been voting together up to this point, there is one scenario where everyone's safe and great, and then you did something that had no benefit, and it didn't. Like, I understand the reasons why he did it, but it's way too. There's too much risk. There's an instant risk here. Whereas even with the JT letter, it's like, okay, you gave away an idol to someone on a different tribe, not great, but that doesn't directly mean therefore you will be voted out, right? Whereas the Tyson one, that's that's what happened. So I think that that's worse. Yeah, the letter is so interesting, because I agree with what you're saying, that yes, people say it could have worked. And I think what I was bringing up before, of like, you could see other players doing the same thing, is saying it's not the idea to give the letter isn't the thing that I have issue with. It's the exact circumstances of, that this is heroes versus villains. He is a villain. Now there's a little bit of like, well, Candace was supposed to be a villain, but then got switched because of the number of people
yeah,
in the so maybe they thought, how much of a villain is he? Just to, I'm sorry, but to bring it back to myself again, I played on a heroes versus villains game once where I was a villain. I did not personally view myself as a villain, and I think I played a very heroic game in that game. So I think it's like, it can ebb and flow. From the outsider perspective, yeah, no one would ever give Russell an idol. That's so dumb. But he didn't know any better. And that's just why I'm like, it's a dumb move, but I don't say it's the worst move, because I at least see how, with his eyes, it's like, worst case scenario, you just gave an idol away. Best case scenario, this is a great move. And especially because he came from Tocantins, where like cross tribal allies were a thing, sort of.
yeah. I think that's a great point. But I will say, worst case scenario isn't that he's just getting away with an idol. It's giving it away an idol, and then it's being used against you to
Well,
make you
right,
go home,
right.
right? So but I think that's a great point, that because it feels like a move I would probably could have totally done, because it's like you want to have control over the game, and it's like you have something in your pocket and you can influence the other tribe. Like, how exciting! And I'm someone who has no discipline at all. Like, I would just go with whatever impulse I have and probably make a worse decision. So it is just it's very fascinating, and it's like you can't talk about JT without talking about like the letter. I feel like that's the
The
first thing.
moment.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So Mary, you said you were a fan of JT on Token Sheens. How has your like experience with him as a contestant kind of changed over the time? Have you just always been on the JT boat for entirety? Were there moments where you considered getting off, or what's your journey
Well,
been?
unlike y'all, I tend to lean to rooting for the strategic players. Like, when I watch the game, that's what I root for. So when I watched, or big characters, but for me, in Token Sheens, like, I was like a Tyson day one stan. Like,
Yeah.
that was where I was going, which is why I'm also so mad about Tyson and Heroes versus Villains. Like, that's probably why I have
Yeah.
that part. So I found that, like, in the beginning, I thought JT was a very deserving winner, but he's more the kind of person my sister would root for more so than me. Like, she's always like, I don't know who is the most attractive guy. Like, I'll just root for them. Like, I mean, it sounds bad, but that's like 100% how she roots.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm like, oh, let's pick someone interesting. So of the pair, was more of a Steven person, more of a Tyson person. But I felt like the thing that he did um was like, you just can't deny the appeal that he had to almost everyone around him universally. Like, it seemed like there were very few people in that game. Very few, there were some, but it seemed like there were very few people um who were not immune to his charm, right? Like, that everybody liked him, and I felt like that was something. So I sort of rooted for him. I rooted for his tribe, but at the end of the day, I was just more like, okay, yeah, I approve of him. It's actually, having watched it back, that I feel better about him, um because he, like, there's chaos happening all around him, and he's just able to go kind of straight through it. And I felt like that was so impressive. Whereas because it's like it seems like he knew the exact moments to turn on his people, to turn on his new allies. And probably, especially nowadays, you would see so much more like flipping, so much more back and forth, so much more gameplay. Which is probably part of the reason why, in especially Game Changers, he was a lot more unsuccessful, because the game's a lot more fluid at that point, and he's still a little uncomfortable playing that way. I think he's trying, but he doesn't quite have the finesse of, you can't just jump around, you also need to nail down the allies that you have as well. And he just never got in a position again in Game Changers where he was able to have like maybe not a duo like Steven, but like a strong buddy. And so I I rooted for him in Heroes versus Villains and Game Changers, but there were so many more interesting people at that point to root for, like your Sandra or Michaela. So I'm like definitely on that side. But I've never hated JT in the way that it seems like so many people were disappointed by him. I just felt like, oh, but he's trying.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
oh.
yeah. And I will say I was never disappointed by JT because I never put him on this really high pedestal to begin with. So
Yeah.
I feel like I had the long game, like of like not like being heartbroken because, well, to me, I think the way that you mentioned your sister, which I think is a great analogy. I always love watching with someone, or like maybe someone's more of a casual fan, because it's a really great way to get a pulse on like what the editors were trying to make us feel. Because I think if you're so knowledgeable, like it's like you're a coastal elite or an academic of some sort.
We're a little too inside baseball.
Yeah, like we know too
sometimes.
much, and it's like the average person is not, calculating the same things. Nigel and I were in Ecuador a few years ago, right before the pandemic, and we met some Survivor fans at a hostel. And we were like so excited, like, well, who's your favorite contestant? And they were like, we like Joe. And I'm like, oh no, we don't watch the same show. Like we don't.
Yeah.
What you prioritize about this show is maybe the exact opposite of what I'm interested in.
Right. And I feel like there's maybe a similar angle here again, which is that I think part of the reason JT was so popular was that he is kind of like more of a survivalist, and he's like charming and nice. And like, I don't think the fans, the casual fans, even realize that he was so much more strategic, which I think is part of his upside,
Well, right. And I think that that's why he has that both appeal, because instead of some of these other contestants, I mean, especially, season 18, like that's practically the beginning of Survivor at this point. Like for that time, he could have easily said, you know what? No, we're just going to concentrate on challenges. And I don't know. It's not JT's
yeah.
and like, we're not going to do anything, but he did have some strategy. And so he could appeal to both the people who just want someone who's going to win challenges and be the muscle around camp, but also play that middle ground and have some of the strategy in the game. And yeah, it's like I was in a similar scenario with you. I was talking with some coworkers who I had no clue watched Survivor, and it was about this past season 44, and they were like, "Yeah, I just can't believe that Jam Jam's still around. Like he's supposed to be voted off early. Like they just still, I'm like, we're at season 44 and they still think like, oh, the kooky character is supposed to be voted out first. And like, that's not, what are you watching? This is not, did you miss did you watch season 1 and then season 44? Like what happened?
Yeah.
That's not how things happen now. So yeah, JT, he's just so, like, I think because he does have that universal appeal in his first season of, even if there's other people you like more, it's hard to look at him and not at least understand why so many people like him.
Yeah. And I will say, I've always, like I said, I've never loved JT in the way that so many people have, but I've always appreciated him for kind of like what he represents, because I think by the time JT wins, I don't think he's like any of the first 17 winners. I don't know who would be the closest even. Yeah, I can't.
Colby, if he had won.
If he had won, maybe.
Right. I'm trying to think of, because
Ethan's like kind of charming, but they're very different though.
Yeah, Ethan is close. It's like honestly probably most similar in a lot of ways to like Tom Westman, because it's someone who helps the tribe win a lot, does have that little like little bit of a sneaky kind of
Yeah.
strategy side that you're seeing, right? But it's like maybe you miss it on the first watch, or maybe you miss it if you're, if you're more casually watching it. But when you go back, you see that had a lot of close allies. I think someone like that who's, but JT just had so much more like, the other tribe, Oolong is not like in love with Tom in the way
Yeah.
that so many of the people were here. And I think that there was just someone who, I'm trying to think of someone who's similar to this. It's like it's not the same as Big Tom, but it's like the JT was such an archetype, right? Like, and this
Yeah.
is at the time when, especially on that season, everybody is like an archetype of who they represent, right? Um, and and so there was probably a lot of people who see JT and just like naturally want to trust him because of whatever bias they have towards that archetype, or people who, like Steven, haven't met someone like that before, don't know whether or not they can trust him, but in their mind they're like, oh well, he's just the like farm hand or whatever. So yeah, it I don't know, because like the Big Tom is like, he's a lot more out there than JT.
Yeah, maybe like
That's a whole
a younger, more
Sure. Well-spoken.
language proficient, Big Tom, perhaps.
Yeah.
And for the record, Mary and I are from the same state as Big Tom, so we really
Yeah.
can't look
Yeah.
down too much of him. But I do think JT stands out. Like, he's, I think, the second Southerner to actually win, and like it's because Tina Weston's the first. And I feel like they feel like
Mhm.
really good, like archetypal, like people
Mhm.
who are like charming, easygoing, get along with, hard workers, like kind of these like classic tropes. And I kind of appreciated that, like, like that clearly he was able to just like make everyone like love him. But I also sometimes feel like people, I what I will say about Steven and JT, because obviously their relationship has existed post show and it's like beautiful and whatever. But I think sometimes people like really glom onto their dynamic. And I've always felt like it's not that surprising that they got along, just because it's like, well, did you think JT would hate Steven? Like, I don't think so. I guess I sometimes I feel like maybe there's like a low impression of JT, or people who are like JT or from that part of the country, that like makes it so surprising that he would get along with someone from New York or a Jewish person. For it's like, but to me it's like, I mean, JT's educated. I mean, he's not like, this is not crazy to me.
Part of it is that it's really easy to like portray them as opposites.
Mhm,
And like
right.
that's
Yeah.
like what's interesting
Yes.
about them as a duo. It's that it's quote unexpected. You have the New Yorker and the Southerner. They're really able to have like a dichotomy in several ways, which it maybe is not even necessarily the most accurate portrayal, but it's one that the show is able to like pretty easily push forward.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot like you take, I don't know how old Steven was during that season.
It was like
but
28, 29, I think.
yeah, so a little older, but it's like they're both these, 20-something-year-old guys who probably have a lot more in common than they have different. But because they're in like, I mean, like literally the outfit of the archetype they're supposed to represent, it's
Yeah.
very easy, especially if you're people who, I think both of them were pretty good TV characters, like right, pretty good at confessionals and stuff like that, that they know, oh, it's the city mouse, country mouse kind of things. Like, I'll play that up. I'll play up like, oh, I don't know what to think about this, city boy. I've never had a friend like that. It's like, you probably have, come on. But I say that like everybody is aware of those kind of things, but apparently Nigel didn't know that the East Coast had skyscrapers. So like, I don't know.
I think that the cities are like New York, LA.
Yeah.
where
All
it's
those
like-
other states, they're just flat.
I'm just not imagining tall buildings as often.
Yeah, which means you totally have been suckered in by JT's charm.
Right.
Probably.
Yeah, you probably would have never seen someone like, what is this? Plaid? People wear that in real life?
All of his charms easily work on me. I'm blindly following him to the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I do think that, and we should also note that, Steven, like any insecurity about how JT might feel about him, I think is real, because like Spencer, who is closeted,
Right.
to his tribe, doesn't share that either. So it's like totally normal for people to like have hesitancy in a game that's all about social relationships. And I think, in the way that I always give credit for Natalie White for I think the key to her success is that she managed her relationship with Russell the best. Russell got rid of all these people, but he never even considered really getting rid of her. And that's because she knew how to work with him. And I think even if people want to give Steven all the credit in strategy, which I don't think is fair, but even if I was to accept that as a reality, I don't think you can't deny that JT managed his relationship with Steven exceptionally well, where this guy was like totally willing to go with him and support him. They go with him. Like they had an option with the Exile Alliance, but they totally just fold those cards to go with JT's path, which totally benefits him more often. And literally all these people are just throwing their games away for him, which made me, I think, dislike Tokensheens at the time, because I loved the kind of the chaotic pettiness where people hate each other and they're all like really striving to win. I always say that 15, 16, 17 is the era of the girls and the gays as a Survivor fan, in the sense that I found Sucks at that time, which was totally an overdrive at that period. And Tokensheens just felt like a season where, oh, like it's very male focused, and Coach really pushes a iron sharpens iron, which I kind of feel like is, while maybe not on its face misogynistic in any way, certainly seems to benefit more of the men, but like by nature. And so I found it frustrating that like it felt like it's like, did the Marquesas like row 2-4 never fall? Like, why are we like all like kind of accepted? Like you can make different choices, but because they were so likable and rootable, I think it totally works out and it's not a big deal. But I just I think there's just so many angles here.
And I think, not to turn this once again into the Tyson podcast, but I think that also explains a lot of like why Tyson makes a lot of the decisions he does in Heroes versus Villains, because he just was participating in a season where everyone prioritized the path that works best for one person over themselves. So at the first opportunity to say, wait a second, this is what Rob's saying to do, but I've got an idea that will put me just one step ahead. I'll befriend Russell and we'll get Parvati out. And he's thinking that that's going to help him, not realizing the super obvious bad downside. But I think that that comes into play of the experiences you had and trying to mitigate those in the future. And yeah, it's like rewatching Tokensheens, there's a lot of moments that I think on the first watch, you don't realize stand out as being so, whether they be misogynistic or at the very least, just, it's like every character is framed through the lens of their relationship with JT after a certain point, especially after the merge. And some do that more so than others. Obviously, there's a lot of like the Sierra versus Debbie stuff and that kind of thing that like doesn't super involve JT. But the point is, these are two people from the same tribe who are going at it against each other, which benefits JT, and he's moving forward. And so he is at least on good enough terms with both of them separately that they're not looking at him and by extension Taj and Steven and the other people on his tribe. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people stuck with him, was because they're saying, hey, well, it's benefiting me to stick with him, right? Like who knows what would have happened if Steven turns on JT earlier. Maybe Steven wins, or maybe Coach wins. Like there's just so many sliding doors. So it's like at least he got second.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump in here. So I did some research, since this is all about, is JT overrated? I think we have to understand where is he rated, and so I looked on Reddit and found, I just kind of searched JT's name and just saw like what kind of came up. Some of the things I noticed, some posts here. Quite often there are questions like, what is the sub's opinion of JT? And quite often the top comments are things like, his first game was a masterpiece. Since then, he's been playing with house money and aware of it, and he swings for the fences. Other people say people are too hard on him about his other games. He was playing with house money. He didn't care about winning. He just wanted something new. Other people say his gameplay got worse with each season. His game in Tokensheens was pretty flawless. I think he probably plays best when he doesn't have to try too hard and just relies on his social prowess. Once he starts trying to make big moves, his game falls apart. On the flip side, that's when he's also way more entertaining. So I do think there is a perception of where there's a lot of people out there that are like, yeah, maybe JT's second, third outings aren't nearly as impressive, but like you really can't knock against his first game still. Like that's not really fair. Is that your read, Mary? Or
yeah, that's my read. I mean, I think a lot of people, like the people who are really down on JT, you can look back at Tocantins and say, oh my gosh, he wasn't even doing anything so masterful. It's just everyone else handing it to him. And I think nobody hands a game to someone for no reason. They do it because there's something that person is doing, right, to make you want to root for them. Actually, JT, we're talking about him in the context of being like almost more of a, old to middle school sort of winner in Tocantins, but the last couple of winners who have won in maybe not unanimous votes, but like landslides, I think there's a lot to be said for getting to a point in the game where everyone just likes you so much that they're okay with you winning. It's not that JT season literally had people say like, I want JT to win over me. Right. But I don't think that that's that different from people nowadays saying, I just like them so much, I just want them to win. What you read about people saying he was playing with house money in the future, I think that it's better to try something different if you've already won, just to see how far you can get, knowing that there's probably less of a chance that you'll win and fail, but then at least you can walk away and go, well, I was trying something different. Like I was doing something. And I think that that's kind of more what JT was doing. Whereas if he had come into his future seasons, tried to play exactly the same, he probably still wouldn't have won. And then people would start to question, how charming is he really? What was going on that first season? Because he's doing the same things now and it's not working. So,
Yeah. And I totally get what you're saying. And I've always been someone, and I think it's because I was an OG fan, if you will. I remember in All Stars about how the winners were just totally dead on arrival. And so it was really impressive that JT as a winner could really kind of control so many of the votes in the Heroes tribe and gain so much power early on. And I've never believed your future outings should be held against you, because I think it's inherently different. Like Tina Wesson got 18th place, but I'm not going to say that invalidates her game, because like it's a different game. Like you're not playing with strangers, which I think Survivor is supposed to be. But obviously we've had so many different versions of Survivor. You had Blood versus Water, all of this. It's kind of hard to really compare all winners anyways. But I just think at most you can get more points on your return, but you can never be deduct. Like he has a floor, and one of the best floors to start off with, that no matter what he does, and what I think is one of the dumbest moves of all time, doesn't change the fact that he still had, on his first time ever, had so many people eating out of the palm of his hands, just loving him throughout. And like I couldn't understand that from my television screen, because I could never imagine so many people liking me. Just like so many people like were willing with other games. I'm like, this defies all logic. But like, if you are that charming, you can do it. And I actually think internet fans in particular kind of don't realize how important the social game is when you're living with people. It is like the most important thing.
And also because JT is one of the people who was both liked by the people on the show and the people watching in that first season. Whereas we've seen cases where someone will see a season and everyone will talk about how great they were, and the viewers just like can't relate to it. They can't get it. They're not there. They're not seeing the magic. They're not whatever. But apparently in person, they're very likable. And then we've also seen the opposite, which is the viewers watching someone going, oh, they're so cool. They're so nice. Why doesn't everyone like them? But the players there go, yeah, but actually they were really annoying. Or, oh, we could tell they were trying to be likable. They were playing a character. Like I could picture myself going on Survivor and being like, I'm going to try to play just like the likable, lovable, where people want to help me, want to help me win or whatever. But I think that would be too hard of an act to keep up. So I think with JT, he's genuinely likable in a way that people watching the show got, and also people on the show felt. Yeah. And that's not like nothing. Like that's, some of it maybe you're born with it, but like also a lot of it I think has to do with JT being aware of the perception he had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is in his Tocantins bio that he talks about part of his strategy is going to be downplaying himself, really play into a lot of the, oh, shucks, perceptions that these people are going to have of him. And, I think that this show has clearly demonstrated over the years that they don't always know exactly how to portray someone's social game in a way
Mhm.
that really makes sense and kind of captures what the players there were seeing at the time too. I remember with Michelle Fitzgerald, I didn't think that it really translated how good of a game she was playing in the footage that you get in
Mhm.
Co Wrong. But listening to her RHAP interviews coming back for Winners at War, I am completely transported. I totally see it now. And so I think it's very possible that watching Tokenshiens, you don't even actually see everything that he's doing that really is allowing him to y- be someone who should be a threat in other people's eyes. But for some reason or another, they're never actually trying to go
And the same
after
that,
him.
like, I feel like, we can go to the Grand Canyon and take a picture. It's never going to be what it's like to be there,
Right.
And I think about that. If you think about that for these characters that are likable that you don't understand, I think that's a healthy way to like try to like appreciate a character, because this is a character appreciation podcast at the end of the day. What I wanted to say to you, Nigel, that you mentioned his bio. I found his bio from Tokenshiens, and in it, this is back when they didn't even have questions. It was just kind of like
It
paragraph
was like a
form.
statement.
And it said, this ambitious 24-year-old gets fired up when people insult his intelligence. And he says, quote, "I'm not a dumb hillbilly, so don't think it. However, this may just be the strategy that JT chooses to use and isn't above playing the dumb and innocent country boy role in an effort to gain alliances with the women," which I think is funny because it absolutely worked with the men. Like they seem particularly the most in love with JT. So I think that really speaks that like he came in with a plan, with an idea, with an understanding of who he is, and you really can't knock him for any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to then mention I found a popularity poll from 2016 on the subreddit. So they ranked every single contestant, everyone like kind of scored between 1 and 10. And at that time, 575 people, because this is what Co-Wrong-ish time. So his Game Changers appearance is not there, but we have a Tokenshiens and a Heroes versus Villains appearance. So I wanted to ask you, Mary, which JT appearance do you think is ranked higher? And let's just start with that.
Mm. I mean, I would hope that Tokenshiens appearances.
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of obvious and easy. Yes, it is higher, but what percentile do you think he is? Do you think he's like top 10%, middle of the pack? Where
For the Tokenshiens one, mm. All right, remind me who's ranking this?
the subreddit,
The subreddit.
the Survivor subreddit. So obviously there's a bias amongst the people who are there. He'd be rated differently in different corners of the internet.
And is this ranking happening so that you have the ranking for both seasons, but did the ranking take place? Like, did the Tokenshiens ranking take place after his performance in Heroes vs. Villains or before?
Yes, it was. So this is around 32 or so. So some years had passed, but they ranked both. They went through like the Google form, I imagine it was. Also, I appreciate all these questions. I was just reading
Yeah, I was trying to think because I think if they were ranking like as it went along, I think it's extremely high for Tokenshiens. But I think if you're sort of also thinking about it, I'd say that he's top 20%.
He is in the 3rd percentile.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he's that popular.
So wow. Okay. I was thinking he was gonna have a lot more of a downswing after the Heroes versus Villains. Okay.
And his Heroes versus Villains appearance, he's still in the 19th percentile. So
Wild.
he's still like really popular in that sense, but he's a lot more polarizing. There's a higher standard deviation.
And that makes sense to me. But I think that maybe something that helps him in this rating here is that the move does not work, but he's swinging for the fences. And I think that Reddit tends to be skewing a bit more male, a bit more into the strategy specifically. So I think that this is a group that he would probably do well in. And I don't want everyone to be successful in Survivor. I want people to mess up and flub and create some exciting moments. And I think he delivers on that.
Yeah, and so his Tokenshiens performance or score, they also show like data about what demographics tended to like these people. What correlations are we seeing? And he has strong positive correlations with, no surprise, Steven from Tokenshiens. How you feel about him probably indicates a lot how you feel about JT. He also is correlated with Yule from Cook Islands, so that appearance, which makes sense. Underdog tribe, merging in, winning, being popular, well-liked. And then Jeremy Collins, Cambodia, which is also a likable figure, wins unanimously.
Strategic, but like also very much about their personality and how they're able to get along with people.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that I'd forgotten about that comparison, but I think that post Tokensheens, we see more people win in similar ways to JT than we did before.
Yeah.
And
I
I
think
don't
he
know if
like
that
kind
would
of
have
gave him a
just
roadmap.
right, and I don't know if that would just like if that would have happened or at least happened as soon after. I mean, even with like Adam Klein too. Like, I don't know if the other unanimous winners, if they would have won unanimously had JT not at that time, just because it hadn't happened yet. So I don't know. That's interesting.
And then I have here for his heroes versus villains outing. He has strong correlations with Coach from
Tokensheens
from
or from
Heroes versus Villains Coach. So
Interesting.
you know, again, like maybe you really like the dragons. you really, that's a huge draw because I loved them. That's
Oh,
that's my favorite JT moment. It's the
I
dragons
was gonna
music
say
video.
I forgot to mention that. Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. The JT moment that I've gone back and rewatched the most for sure is the drag. I mean, that comes a lot more because I'm a Courtney Yates fan, so it's the
Yes.
Courtney part that but like that whole Ponderosa, all of the episodes with JT and the dragons. I mean, that's like those are the
Yeah.
best. That's the best JT, right?
Yeah, and I will, because I want to say this earlier about how I've never held subsequent appearances against people because the game is just different, and I think you can talk about how like the culture is different in different groups, right? Because
Mhm.
Coach is like he is like a cult essentially in two of his seasons, by some assessments, and Heroes versus Villains, like his tribe thinks of him as a kind of a joke, right? So
Yeah.
they don't take him nearly as seriously, and JT is not taken the same way because, well, I mean, he's still liked for the most part, but it is just so different between them. But yeah, both JT outings very popular. And then I also found some information on how he was perceived at the time as well. So I found a CBS article or an article named CBS Survivor winner JT Thomas gets through Game of Life using his great personality. So again, like the likability thing is really hammered home here. And a few quotes, and I'll get your reactions. Is he as likable as he appears? Absolutely. Period.
There we go.
No need to elaborate. Yes.
I really don't know what it is, he said just before his early show appearance. Quote, people just seem to like me, end quote. And then later he has some other quotes that say, it's always been that way for some reason. In high school, people loved me, including my teachers. In college, people loved me. I played all sports and all the parents loved me. I've never met anyone who didn't like my personality or attitude, he adds. I knew I had that advantage going in and that people weren't aware of it. So like, I first will comment that that's why he's so charming. He's like kind of humble about it. Cause this is like, because things come off very arrogant to be like, well, everyone loves me, but he's like, I don't know. People just seem to like me.
Isn't that weird?
It's so disarming in a way. But Mary, do you have any reactions to this?
Yeah, I mean, the absolutely period like that. I've never met JT, probably never will meet JT, but I could imagine that he's still on my list of Survivor players that like would feel like celebrities to meet.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Um because they are so iconic in at least one of their games. And I would say Jakey is iconic in all of his seasons just for very different
Yes.
reasons.
Yeah.
But someone who I think he gets, it's like he understands that people do like him and that he's going to have that appeal. He doesn't really understand why, like what it is that and it's probably just because it's who he is, right? It's natural. He can play up some things without trying to play a part. Whereas someone like Coach feels a lot more like he's playing a part,
It's like
right?
he's reading out a mantra or a book.
Right. Think about like Carolyn, right, from this most recent season. I think that Carolyn is aware of the way that she comes across and therefore can play up or mask some of the strategy with her true real personality. And I think that the JT was similar. He says, I understand that people like me. I don't really get why, but it's working for me. So I'm going to play that part up. I'm going to hide my intelligence. I'm going to play up the aw shucks part. But I'm not going to create this character that's what I'm not.
Yeah. And I think I remember Steven once saying about in Cambodia that, well, Jeremy didn't have to make because it's like if you're well liked, you don't really have to change the game up in a way. So
Yeah.
it's like, why wouldn't you just rely on your social skills if that is
Mhm.
the best thing in your arsenal? And I think, as someone who has always been a bit more polarizing, I will say that I cannot fathom again how you could be so likable. So of course my brain is immediately thinking about all the contingency plans you need to create to mitigate the fact that you will have to have an enemy. But clearly JT did not have one at all in Tokenshiens.
And it helps with people like JT and Jeremy that they are despite whatever the statistics might be of whether or not they're truly amazing at challenges or not, and that kind of changes based on different seasons and stuff, they at least are not the kind of people who are going to be targeted for being challenge liabilities.
Mhm.
It's just the truth of the matter. So they have a little bit of that to lie back on. And I think some of it, especially with Steven, who's played with both of them, neither of JT or Jeremy have the same like they aren't as hard on themselves, right? They don't have the same sort of baggage of like being like Kevin, like you're saying, like, oh, why would people like me though? I'm not, I'm not like I think that Steven has a lot more of those kind of concerns for himself that can hold him back from just, if Steven just went in and said, I'm just going to assume people like me and like my personality and then just, relax and be myself. But the truth of the matter is, most people don't have that ability. Most people have at least a little bit of apprehension about whether or not everyone's going to like them and whether or not they're everyone's cup of tea. And so they can't just be themselves and just assume everyone's going to like you.
Yeah. It's kind of like I feel like you always hear people give advice on like getting cast on reality TV or not. And it's always like a very charming person saying, just be yourself. And for so many people, like that doesn't make any sense because being myself has never worked. Like why
Right.
would it happen? But JT and I think people of that personality type in particular are able to do that. What I wanted to now move on to was this article in Medium titled Imperfect Perfection, the Survivor Enigma That is JT Thomas, because this is after Game Changer. So I think it really
Oh,
kind of
okay.
encompasses, maybe some of the more complicated feelings towards JT's legacy.
Mhm.
Some things I will highlight here. In terms of playing the game, I think JT feels like he doesn't have to show anyone he understands how to win. Instead, JT is going to go out there and looking to make flashy and gigantic moves. If either of those two failed attempts work out for him, JT is sitting pretty and has an incredible resume. As it turns out, they don't work for him. But because of his previous win, JT doesn't lose sleep over it. Goes on to say, what's frustrating for people watching the show is that when these moves fail, JT isn't just screwing himself. Yeah, he can be okay with losing the game, but in Heroes versus Villains, he spells certain doom for Amanda, Colby, and Rupert, and then in parentheses it says, and Candace Woodcock, but no one out there was cheering for her to win Heroes versus Villains.
They needed to get the dig in there.
Yeah, just make sure.
Oh my
And then
gosh.
it says, as a viewer, it gets frustrating. Same goes for Game Changers, where his failed attempts knock out Malcolm, a perennial fan favorite. And it's the reason players like Sandra and Aubrey go forth without any real numbers. So any reactions to some of that about maybe why there is some kind of frustration, even if there are people who appreciate the ballsiness of his game, Nige?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do get that. But let's be clear: the bad boot order in Game Changers can not only lie at JT's feet.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like he's not the only person responsible for that. So I do think that is a legitimate criticism if you want to levy it.
But I also really quickly to say is that we can't lay it at his feet for the Game Changer boot order. While doing my JT research on the subreddit, if you search JT, some of the most common things you'll find is a meme, and it'll be like JT whispering to Brad, and it goes, "The moment JT ruined Game Changers." So like there is a feeling that exists with some people. But go ahead.
I don't remember where I was going after that. I think that's just fun.
I apologize. Maybe it'll come back to you. Mary,
Yeah.
do you have a reaction to any of the maybe how JT's gameplay is different as the seasons, because he's playing with quote house money, but I think narratively can also affect how viewers are seeing the season.
Right. And I think that's part of what I was kind of saying before was like JT, part of the reason I think that he failed in his future seasons was because he was trying things and mixing things up, which I think were good, but forgetting the part of, oh, and you also still need close allies. And part of that is if you're playing with house money, it is a very singular thing because you're thinking, I'm going to try things and it's easier to to do that if I'm not worried about my partner. If he was paired up with someone throughout most of Game Changers, he probably wouldn't have tried as many of those big moves because he's probably trying to think, well, I need to we need to keep some security here. So it's like, which one do you want? Do you want to see the big moves and the chance that they might fail or they might succeed? Like, a lot of people probably found him more entertaining, but then it's going to have that downside. Whereas if he had paired up with someone, he probably wouldn't have tried those. Might have been more of a boring player, but might have done better. So, we'll never know in that circumstance. So I think it's valid to say that. I don't think that you can say that he's the one who ruined the season. Because the other part of it is people were letting him make some of these moves.
Yeah.
Someone let him send the letter to Russell. Nobody told him,
Yeah.
"Hey, don't do that. This is a
They all
bad idea."
co-signed. They all were
Yeah.
like, they were all on board. I like to think if Suri was there, she'd been like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
Yes,
Right. Well,
absolutely.
or actually, probably Sari would have been like, "JT, that's such a bad move," and then in confessional being like, "Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna tell him it's a good move though, because if he's out, then that's better for me or whatever." Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. And I think that's what's hard is because he was trying things and didn't have the blessing of like a close ally who's strategically working on these things with him in like a partnership. Mostly I'm thinking about Game Changers here. In Game Changers he was going rogue a bit more.
But
And
even in Heroes versus Villains, I feel like, he's kind of a one-on-one relationship with Tom and then with James. It doesn't feel like he also has that kind of like core group. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of his, I think I've come down that it's part of his charm actually, is that as Survivor fans, something I think that's been missing lately is the relationship dynamic. Like the concept of the tribe is kind of not a thing anymore, like the deep
Mhm.
bonds. And that's, I think, why the Tikas were so popular in 44, because like we got to see a group that really seemed to support each other and like each other. We wanted to root for a group where in a lot of seasons, especially in the modern era, it's so fluid that like we don't have that. And that's why we love JT, I think, in Token Cheese, is because we see him kind of like tucking Steven under his wing a little bit. And we kind of like people kind of doing those things. But I know I interrupted you, Mary.
Well, and so many of the best moves in Survivor, the best strategic moves, require the knowledge sharing and trust of multiple people. Um, there are certain times where, yeah, if you got a bunch of idols, you can do a cool strategic move by playing all your idols at one time. But like even Parvati playing the multiple idols, she needed the support and knowledge of Russell in order to obtain those idols. She couldn't have just done it completely on her own. So JT can do some things on his own, but those things aren't necessarily going to be successful without other people backing him up. Um, and it's hard because like it's not like there were tons of wild idol plays and massive strategic swings in Token Sheens, but he did have the ability to bounce ideas off of a person and to get feedback. And I think he just didn't really have that in the future seasons to the extent that he would have needed. Because if he did have someone, maybe they're gonna say, "No, JT, don't do this." But maybe they'll say, "But let's tweak it a little and try this other
Mhm.
thing, and this may work." It might be slightly less flashy, but it might actually work. And maybe we look at JT as one of the like most strategic players of all time or something. Who knows? Probably
Yeah.
not, but
I
whatever.
think like a moderating force probably does him
Yeah.
a lot of good, because he is, I mean, the fact that he's able to think about so many different ways to approach, like swimming away on the raft and stuff. I mean, these are very creative ways to like make choices.
And it actually kind of does remind me a little bit of Todd Herzog from China
Mhm.
in his partnership with Amanda, where I think that Todd is the one of that duo that tends to come up with some harebrained ideas that Amanda's always like a little pump the brakes. I don't know if it's a good idea, Todd. Maybe we shouldn't do this. I think that that is a critical piece for both of their winning
Yeah.
games.
And not to turn this to an Amanda podcast, but I will also say that, Amanda also missing, I think, the assertive strategic partner that she tends to rely on in like Todd or Parvati is shown in Heroes versus Villains, where she can't like lie to Parvati very well at all. It's like, I
Mhm.
think maybe she needs someone who's a little bit more direct, like to help her in situations, in the way that I think JT could use someone who's a little bit more moderating. And like, I think it's important to have people that are going to balance you in those games.
Sure. I mean, we're talking about all this, but like in Game Changers, we see a very similar scenario just turned up to 11 when you look at Tony. Tony had that moderating force in Trish and then doesn't have it. And like that, and so it's not as extreme with JT because JT wasn't quite wasn't quite doing the same type of big moves that Tony was, but it's similar of someone kind of playing with house money, someone who's probably, I think Tony also had a similar concern of, I had such an awesome game the first time. How do I live up to that? And Tony's idea was, I'm just going to do the exact same thing turned up to 11, right? Like,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the partnership, the moderating force, or like you said, the person who's going to be the one coming up with the schemes, who needs the moderator, like all of that, it probably factors in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to say one other thing though. You mentioned Candace Cody in that one article. I remember vividly though thinking, "Oh wow, look, it's the first time that someone is wearing running shorts while playing Survivor." And that right there was like the extent of my rooting interest, but that was that for a long time I thought of Candace and I was like, "Oh, she was the girl who wore the running shorts."
But you know what? I also recalls that Candace doesn't have pants. Like in Heroes versus Villains, so she's actually probably one of the coldest people like
Yeah.
on the island, where Jerry had like a scarf and a hat, and she had like a
cargo
full
pants.
wardrobe.
Yeah, like come on.
So, Nigel, you're about to say something?
Yeah, Mary, do you find that you normally root for people with running shorts? Is that how you determine your favorites?
Or is
Uh,
clothing attire something that you really have a strong memory of?
I think I root for people in general that I can see myself in one way or another. Or that I like would aspire to be. Like I don't really see myself necessarily in Tyson, but like in my dreams, right? Like I would have that kind of personality. But yeah, I mean, so I think that factors in for sure.
Yeah. So the end of this article, they do mention that JT was not inactive in his success in token chains, or he wouldn't have gotten the credit for it. He specifically sought out Steven because he saw that Steven was smart and a level-headed guy. Coach and Brendan didn't just fall in love with JT out of the blue. JT saw what would appeal to them and brought them over to his side. JT earned that $1 million, and maybe he's not as perfect as token chains would have us believe, but he's also certainly not the terrible player some parts of the internet see him as now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think, to jump the gun a bit, why he can't be overrated, because it's clearly that he's such there's like kind of a mixed bag to begin with. And I don't think you can knock the first performance at all.
And, maybe if JT didn't win his first season, but he wins his first outing, and I think there's real merit to the argument that he was playing with house money after that. He's not a character. He's a real life person who is taking time away from his family, from his job, to go out on location in Survivor. And I'm sure he also wanted to have fun. And that means playing a big game to him, I think. I mean, I think that's pretty clear in both of his outings afterwards. So I think I can't blame him for wanting to be bolder in his return, because could he have possibly looked better after either Heroes versus Villains or Game Changers than he does in Token Chains? Can you look better than Token Chains? That's like the ideal edit that you would get if you went on Survivor, right?
Yeah.
You win. Everybody loves you. You were dominant.
Yeah.
Imagine that like the only way to keep your rating up is to do as well as you did the first time. Like that's impossible, right? If you play a perfect game, you can't play two perfect games. I just don't think that's the case. So I think your best case scenario is either come close or be super memorable. And I think that he kind of went for the second one, right? Like he decided, I'm going to just try some things and see what happens, because I'm probably not going to be able to do as well. So at least I'm going to swing for it.
Statistically, you're not going to do as well.
Right.
I actually think that you could make some parallels between him and Richard Hatch in All Stars, in that, Rich did not believe he would ever make it to the end of All Stars. He's like, I am aware I am everyone's number one target. So I'm going to go out here and I'm going to bite some sharks and I'm going to have some like big character moments. And I think that JT is obviously playing a bit more like strategic than Rich is in All Stars, because I think that the gameplay was just not moving as quickly into pre-merge at that time. But I think you could probably pick up on some decent parallels there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, the last thing on that was I think probably there was a part of JT who also felt like, okay, I tried to play down my intelligence in the first season. He probably heard a decent number of people saying, well, he wouldn't have done as well if he wasn't partnered with Steven. And so he thought, I'm going to try to play more strategically this time. Unfortunately, I think that does hurt his reputation because people say, wow, this is what we get when JT plays strategically. He fails at it. But I think the point is like, but he's failing at it because he's trying so hard to do something out of the, not necessarily his comfort zone, but out of the archetype that he was put into. And I think you shake up the scenario, you put different people in. Russell is actually, somebody else. Like, I think some of the things he tries could have worked and are not any more outlandish than like things that other people do. It's just the way it shook out.
Yeah. And I'm always, like I said, appreciative of someone who's willing to change it up or give us a different version of themselves. In the same way that, like, I think people were really excited that Andrea turned her game up in Karamoan because the Redemption Island game just felt very, like, a lot to be desired. We actually have an episode later this season on Jenna Lewis and the question if she's the perfect heel turn, essentially, because she goes from, like, sweetheart to, like, anti-winner so hard, and like people don't even remember the first Jenna, they only remember the second Jenna.
Oh yeah, that second Jenna's burned into my brain.
Yeah, like we all remember, and it's like that's something. And maybe I didn't always like their choices or decisions. I hate the fact that JT's like dominance on the Heroes Tribe came at the expense of people like Suri, right? But I also was like fascinated, and that's sometimes it's like I want the show not to always go with my favorites, because if that's the case, then it's like I could just read fanfics all day, but like I want to see like different dynamics like kind of be fleshed out. Go ahead, Mary.
Well, you say that he's like a different version of himself, which is so interesting when you bring up people who are more heel turns, is that like I don't think I've never watched Heroes versus Villains or Game Changers and thought, oh, the original JT is ruined for me. Like if I was then going to go back and watch Tocantins, I'm like, no, this still feels like JT. It's just young JT when everything was shiny and bright, right? Whereas there are other people, Jenna Lewis or Colby or whatever, where their second or third showing is the thing that is burned into my brain. It's hard for me to watch their original seasons and like see them that way. I'm still so colored by the heel turn they had later.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely a lot of people who are like that, where I think like Amy's return in Micronesia like hurts her, even though like she's kind of a non-entity in her second season, just because I think for a lot of people it's really hard to separate them.
And I think that JT has such a strong, visible outing the first time that he can flop in a couple of returns, but that doesn't take away from everything that we had from him prior to that.
Yeah. And so I wanted to also then quickly mention that of course, when Game Changers was airing, RHAP was in full swing. So I was able to review some of what was going on then to see what was the reaction by Rob and his company at the time. So the Game Changers episode in which he goes, the know-it-alls, Steven is not there, which was very disappointing to remember once I logged on, because even the comments were like, I was hoping to see Steven defend JT's decisions tonight. Like they all really wanted to know what was going on there. David Wright stands in instead. But like a lot of the comments here talk about, JT minus Steven equals stupid, reckless gameplay. And other ones like, JT, did you not see the writing on the wall when Malcolm got booted? And when they insinuated that you were to blame, ? So definitely there was a visceral reaction to JT's underperformance here that I think almost allowed people to double down on the people that thought his Heroes versus Villains outing was so bad. So like it does feel like for his detractors, Heroes versus Villains and Game Changers is like it's like, well, 2 out of 3 outings he did bad, so that's enough.
Right.
Yeah, but his first one was so much better that I feel like it has to boost it up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a perfect game. Some people don't get a perfect game after like 3 tries, like multiple tries. So it's like, to me, that is part of to consider. And then some of the other things I had written down from listening to that Know-It-Alls episode, Rob mentions that, Sandra has a tendency to work with outspoken women, which kind of, again, like framed, I guess, my viewpoint, because I've always, I remember even that moment, JT was very anti-Michaela. And I always found it so strange because he was saying things like, Michaela doesn't help her out around camp. And I was like, I feel like Michaela actually has a reputation for being a hard worker, but clearly they have such a personality difference that they're just not meshing. And it was kind of weird to see JT so angry with someone because he's usually so like humble and nice. Even in Heroes versus Villains, when he's betraying all these people, he never really gets nasty or anything. So it just was a different angle.
And we see JT in that season, kind of like on his heels in a way that you don't really get in Tokenshiens or in Heroes versus Villains. He swapped the only person in the new group with everybody who had previously
his
been
first swap
together.
ever too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a different situation JT is finding himself in compared to either of the previous seasons.
Yeah. Also, Randy Bailey of Gabon sends in a comment after JT was eliminated, and the quote is, "The more I watch JT, the more I believe he owes Fishback $500,000." So there were definitely the people that were ready to take JT down or like joke about it were like all in full force that night. Mary, do you remember your reaction to his booting Game Changers?
It's funny, as we were talking about this, I was scrolling back in RHAP. I was trying to see when like the first time I ever did a Survivor podcast was, to see if I have any proof of any of that. But it was David versus Goliath, so a little bit later. I feel like I was rooting for JT more in Game Changers than I was in Heroes versus Villains. There were just so many other people in Heroes versus Villains to root for. And that like I said, my sister was probably rooting for him, but there were so many more fun characters. Mostly I was rooting for Courtney Yates. Who's not going to root for her? In Game Changers, that was so interesting because I was a big Aubrey fan. So I was rooting for Aubrey and I like Michaela. And so like when it came to JT's, especially the swap tribe, I was kind of rooting against him, but I liked the fact that he was trying, but it came across more like, to me, not that he was a bad player, but that I wanted him to fail. And so therefore I was happy with those failures because I was rooting for other people. And I don't remember thinking, oh, this is proving that JT is so bad at this. I was thinking instead, basically, oh, JT, like you're close, but you don't realize like that you need to I don't know, like change it just a little bit. And he could never really lock that in, because I think like, especially in that season, when it comes down, you think of like the Michaela and the sugar and all of that, you think, okay, from JT's perspective, I can see why he thinks that the things he's doing are going to work. It just so happened that they were better. He was being outplayed by people like Sandra, and he just couldn't quite see that. And there wasn't anyone like Sandra who was going to outplay him in Tokenshiens.
Yeah.
So so much more of it comes down to that. So I was rooting for Sandra. I wasn't rooting against GT because I disliked him. I was rooting against him because I was rooting for other people.
Yeah. And I will say that I kind of wish that, like, in the way that like Ellie and Gabler in 43 have all this tension, it's like kind of fun. Like I wish that tribe just didn't go to tribal council. I didn't want to lose those people, and it'd been kind of fun to see the other tribes go, because I kind of like when there's tension in a group. That would have been really fun. And I think, as much as I say I might knock JT, we should all give him credit for the fact that, yeah, while he was fooled by Michaela and Sandra, he does flip Aubrey. Like, it's not as if like he was unanimous. Like, he got someone to join and support him, and that, you should give really credit where credit's
And
due.
Aubrey's, nothing to sniff at as far as a player goes either.
Yeah, and she feels like it would have been a really fun like Steven replacement if Aubrey could have been that. They could have had a really fun dynamic. I also found David Bloomberg's Why JT Lost, his podcast in Game Changers as well. And the only things I will mention here is Rob actually brings up an Adam Klein post at the time where Adam mentions, you can't hold future returns against someone's game. And then Rob jokes and says, Adam might be prefacing that in case he does bad in a return season, which is hilariously ironic considering we get the whole like podium of it all, which again, just like JT, I think it just gave him more dimension. I loved it that someone gave us a moment and was willing to go for the fences and give me something to kind of chew and discuss and enjoy and kind of breathe some life into, I think, an era of the show that kind of gets a little sterile for my taste.
And like it, the Adam podium moment, it's like, I think there were so many people watching going, that should have been a thing. Like Adam was on the right path. And so it's sort of this like dodo moment, but like nobody walked away from that going, wow, Adam was overrated in his first season. Look how dumb he is now, right? Like, no, nobody was doing that. They were just saying, hey, at least Adam was trying and it didn't work. So I don't think JT was given the same credit.
Yeah. Also, David Bloomberg mentions that like he doesn't believe the subsequent performances count in the same way that he doesn't hold it against Rob C's poor performance in All Stars, right, on a episode with Rob, and that Rob believes that he got JT's ranking, who was winner ranking in the Evolution of Strategy, correct, because he remembers when he had done it that people thought he placed JT too low, because this is before Game Changers. And I think JT's like 11th, so he's like top third, but not like top 5. And he goes, I feel pretty good about my rating now, considering that we had another week performance. And I think that kind of goes back to my position earlier that like I think he's actually probably pretty appropriately rated. He has highs, he has lows, but like, I appreciate that, because the worst thing on Survivor you can be to me is boring. And I don't think he would ever describe JT as boring, especially in his returns. So that's kind of the research I was able to do. So Nigel, are you kind of ready to start wrapping this up?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about JT's 3 different performances. But Mary, I think having been able to go through everything again, do you think you have the same answer of JT being overrated or not overrated? Have you changed your mind?
I haven't changed my mind, but I think I can frame sort of my perspective a little better now, which is I think JT is not overrated, because I think that he is properly rated based on whatever your criteria is of a good player. If you're someone who is a casual fan, remembers him in Tocantins, saw that dominant performance, and therefore has rated him super high, chances are you probably don't even really remember the things that he did in the future seasons. So your perspective of him is still really high, and I think that's fine. I think for the people who think that he is overrated because they think that he proved in subsequent seasons to not actually be as good as they first saw, I think that they're not giving him the credit for what he did the first time and holding things against him that shouldn't change his rating. So I would say like my personal rating for JT is he did great, and then he was never going to do that great again, so the subsequent things don't really matter. I think when you see people like Sandra or other people who are able to replicate and have good performances multiple times, those are the standouts. And like those should be lifted up and applauded. If you can do something successful multiple times, that's amazing. But that's abnormal. That's not the like I don't think anyone if you're out there saying that JT is like a Mount Rushmore Survivor player, then yeah, you're overrating JT. But I don't think that is the perspective of him. I think the perspective is he had one really dominant game and then some just okay games where we saw more interesting things from him. But yeah, he didn't place as well because he never was going to place as well. And so I think for that, he is properly rated.
Not everyone gets to be Sandra or Tony. As great as that would be, not
2 out of
gets
like
to.
800 appearances. Like it's like so many. It's very hard to.
Yeah, but I think I have a very similar point of view as you do, Mary. I think if anything, hearing the points of view that you were able to find online, Kev, I think I might actually say JT's like a little underrated specific to Tocantins. Because I think that I tend to forget how dominant he actually was, because, I've always thought of myself as like a little bit more of a nerdy person like Steven than JT is. So I think that I really was drawn to Steven and probably had more attention on Steven as I watched Tocantins before realizing like, oh, okay, it's actually going to be JT that wins. So I think that I maybe rank JT a little bit lower, but I think I've had my mind changed.
Yeah, I think JT is not overrated. I think my biggest qualm with him is, or I guess his as a character, right? Because I don't know him as a person. Is that Tokenshiens kind of gets this blanket nostalgic statement, which tends to be like one of my most frustrating things. Is I really want someone to kind of dive into the data with me, give me reasons, convince me. And I think quite often people who just kind of have a more generic, we'll say, positive outlook on JT, they don't want to do any of those things. It's like, I like him. He's nice. He does all the things. I'm like, those aren't good enough reasons for me, but that's because, there's preferences that are just different. And I think his gameplay, which is part of the lens people talk about when someone's overrated, his Tokenshiens game is, I think, a lot better than fans give him credit for. There was a Survivor Twitter poll about who would you voted for, and JT wins, but only 57-43. So it's like he clearly that's not the proportion the jury gave him. So like you can tell that there are a lot of detractors out there, and I think they should probably ease up a little bit on him and just be more appreciative of kind of what he brought. But Mary, any final takes on JT?
My final take relates to what you just said, which is I think there's just a lot about his charisma that we're not going to be able to see unless you're out there with him, unless you're playing a game with him, especially in that first time when he's 24 years old and he's playing the aw shucks game. And so I think like if you're a person who doesn't care as much or doesn't rank the social game as high, you might not be able to love JT in that way. But for the people who do prioritize that, or for the people who at least recognize that factored in majorly to Tokenshiens as a game, you have to like give him props.
Mary, would you have liked to have seen him on Winners at War?
Instead of Nick Wilson. That's my suggestion.
I feel like they would be like a similar archetype.
Yeah, I would say I would like to have seen him, mostly because I would like to have seen anyone who could have helped some of those old school players like have some more numbers. So yeah, I think put him on there. I would not have been rooting for him in that, but I think that I would have been rooting for the people he could have at least been aligned with potentially. But based on the other two seasons that we've seen, for all we know, JT would show up and be like, nah, screw these old school players. I'm going to go help, whoever.
And could you imagine JT on the edge with Natalie Anderson or something? I mean, the creativity there about like how he would sabotage the people around him or like kind of like create harebrained schemes. It really does feel like a universe I wish I could see.
It would have been, I think that my prediction would have been if we had seen JT on Winners at War, we would have seen more confrontational JT. I think that we would have had at least one fight with someone. I don't know who that would have been, but I think it would have happened. It might have been on the edge.
Oh yeah,
it could have been on the edge. And I think maybe he would have had a little bit of a better chance at going further this time because you're surrounded by literally all winners. There's just everybody is a target at that point, so like maybe he would have been able to like sneak by a little bit more easily than he.
And he has Tyson there, he has like connections.
And look at Tony, right? Like Tony benefited from his flop game, and I think that JT probably would have in the same way. I think like if anyone who's out there has been listening to the internet and the zeitgeist around him, they would have thought, JT, he's not all cracked up to be. I think if his best shot would have been coming back and actually just sort of chilling out and playing more like the Tokenshiens JT game.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. Mary predicting JT winning on his 4th time on the show.
Hey, you know what? Some people win on their 4th tries, and they might be the best winner.
Right. Well, Mary, do you have anything to promote that's coming up on RHAP or elsewhere?
Yeah, I do have one thing to promote. I am, I talked a bit about playing Survivor games and things like that, and I am actually going to play the game Can You Survive, which is a live Survivor game that's going to be in Maine this summer, so at the end of July. And Can You Survive is a great, like the production quality is really, really high with them. And now that they've started doing the live games for charity, it's there for a lot of great causes. So each participant has a different charity that they raise money for, and based on your winning placement, you get more money for your charity. So if you would like to watch that or support me, you can go to the Can You Survive website or Can You Survive charity website or Can You Survive charity Facebook page to watch that. And if you are interested in donating to support my cause, which is the Virginia Capitol Trail Foundation, you can go to my Twitter, so at Frail Mary, and it's my pin tweet there if you're interested.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing. That sounds like a really fun and exciting opportunity. So, best of luck. I'm hoping
Yeah.
that this will be like JT's fourth time out,
Right.
and not
Yes.
his second or third.
Yeah. I'll take his first game too. Yeah, that would be great.
All right. And Kev, what do we have coming up?
So we have a few more episodes of You Thought You Knew this season. So we are going to be releasing our episode with Beth Dixon on Aussie. The question is Aussie one of the best to never win? And then after that, we have James Clement episode with Mike Bloom. About is James the ultimate fan favorite. So some really fun legends to talk about in the next few weeks.
Absolutely. And where can folks find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Asian Narc, which is short for my Instagram handle at Asian Narcissist.
And you can find me on Twitter at Nigel Speed, like the word speed limit. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today on this lovely journey about JT Thomas. We hope to have you again next time. Take care.